Continuing today, looking at the life of Elisha. So far in looking at his life in Kings, we've noticed that this man was very, very committed to God and actually to Elijah. He allowed nothing to get in his way. He allowed nothing to hinder him from pursuing and receiving all that God had for him. Last week we looked at the widow and the oil, and I just loved that story. And here you have this widow who has a couple sons, and she is in extreme debt. Literally, she is overwhelmed. She's overwhelmed. And she goes to Elisha, the man of God, and Elisha, of course, has her fill up some jars. And I love that, and that God provides enough. And it's not just barely enough, but it's more than enough. It's enough for her to pay the debt that she could not pay, but it's enough for them to live on. It's God. It's God at work. This is just who He is. It's His nature. It's His character. Today, as we continue looking at the life of Elisha, we're going to look at the story of Naaman. The story of Naaman. You've probably heard of this man. And what's really neat about his story is the more you look at it, you see the importance of a few other characters that really are unnamed in this story. They may seem like bit players, but when you look at it, you realize the important part they played. And when you really look at the overarching story of Naaman, it's more than just a man who gets cured of a sickness, but it's really a story of salvation because his life is literally changed. So let's jump into it, starting in 2 Kings 5, verse 1. The king of Aram, first off, Aram, a lot of times they would raid the Israelites. They would continually be fighting against them and robbing them and plundering them and doing what they do. They were enemies of the Jewish people. It says, Aram had great admiration for Naaman, the commander of his army, because through him the Lord had given Aram great victories. But though Naaman was a mighty warrior, he's like the second in command behind the king, he suffered from leprosy. This is not a good thing to have. So here you have Naaman, this mighty warrior. And honestly, Jewish tradition holds that Naaman shot the fateful arrow that killed King Ahab. It's really interesting. But the truth is, you look at his story, and he seemed to have it all. But he suffered from leprosy. This is where Naaman finds himself. And if you know anything about leprosy, it was a horrible, horrible skin disease that would slowly and surely eat away at your body and literally could ultimately bring about your death. And the thing about Naaman getting leprosy is it's a really big deal because Naaman is a big deal. He's this rich, powerful, important person in the king's army. For Naaman to get leprosy, it would mean that he would begin and would soon lose pretty much everything he had. It would be rock bottom for him, and his life would begin to shrink to absolutely nothing. His power, his status, his influence, his role, it would all be gone. So Naaman knows this, and he knows it's all about to slip away. And then who's going to help this man? As you get into this story, again, I want to say this leprosy that begins to plague Naaman is very similar, and oftentimes in the Old Testament, is compared to sin, because leprosy, like sin, is incurable. Leprosy, like sin, if you get one spot on your body, you were declared unclean. All it takes is one sin to begin to separate us from God. If you've read through the Old Testament and even the New Testament, you understand it wasn't just a big deal medically, but it was a big deal socially. It was a big deal religiously. If you had this, you would be screaming unclean. And really, when you look at somebody with leprosy, and even Naaman, you simply become like a dead man walking. So this is where Naaman is finding himself. Now at this time, Aramean raiders had invaded the land of Israel, and among their captives was a young girl who had been given to Naaman's wife as a maid. One day the girl said to her mistress, "I wish my master would go see the prophet in Samaria, Elisha. he would heal him of his leprosy. And here you have this young girl who's not only been plucked from her home, but she's been plucked from her home country. You can look at her life and you could almost say she is a reluctant missionary, because where she is, she's speaking truth. And the first point I make about this story is speak where you are. You are light. She didn't sit around and bemoan her situation. Think about that. Think if you were just taken away. She could have bemoaned her situation. It would have been the easy thing to do. After all, what else does she? She is all alone in a foreign land and she knows nobody. But there's something about this servant girl. She not only knew about Elisha, but she remembered him. And beyond that, she had faith that Elisha could heal Naaman. See, her faith is what begins to change Naaman's life. It totally changes the trajectory of this story and the trajectory of Naaman's life. I love that about this girl, that she had the boldness to speak out. She is a servant in a foreign country and has the audacity to say something to her mistress about this man living in Syria. That takes a lot of guts. That takes a lot of boldness. I think she understands what is said in Matthew, that you are the light of the world. You know, we say that a lot and we hear it a lot. I don't know if we actually believe it or we actually do it. I mean, Jesus is saying, look, you are a light. And he says, you are like a city on a hilltop that cannot be hidden. No one lights a lamp and puts it under a basket. Instead, a lamp is placed on a stand where it gives light to everyone in the house. You see, where you are, we need to begin being that light. And this little girl is such a challenge to all of us, in that she had every reason to whine and complain, but she stood up for truth. You know, it reminds me of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They find themselves taken away, but what do? They stand up for what they know is truth and what they know is right. Be a light shining where you are. You can change the lives of people around you. And this is what happens in this story. So the king of Aram hears this and tells Elisha, tells Naaman, go visit this prophet. I'll send a letter. Verse 6, the letter to the king said, with this letter, I present my servant Naaman. I want you to heal him of his leprosy. So the enemy king of Aram sends a letter to the king of the Israelites, says, look, I want you to heal my servant. So the king reads this letter, tears his clothes, and says, am I God that I can give life and take it away? Why is he asking me to do this? That's what I love about this part. Think about what's going on here. The king of Aram expected that if there was a man who could heal someone of leprosy, that the king of the Israelites would be acquainted with him. The problem was the king of the Israelites was a rather wishy-washy person. And he had no true, thriving relationship with God nor his prophet Elisha. I say that because I'm going to tell you something. This is something that we often do, is I really believe people know you're a follower of Christ. Are you? And they're going to come to you when tough times come. Are you ready? See, the king was not ready. People put expectations on you. I was just talking with Robin about this. Robin, some sad news. Her uncle passed away recently, and it's on her mom's side. And so what's really interesting in talking about it with Robin is that side of the family, not many of them have always been strong followers of Christ. But even throughout this time, and even earlier in their life, whenever they were going through a tough situation, guess who they called? They called my mother-in-law, because they knew that she had a thriving relationship with God. They knew that she would have some kind of wisdom and answer. So they may have disregarded God most of the time, but when the rubber met the road, they knew who to call. Well, I'm telling you, you need to be ready. I feel that sometimes people are coming at us and we're like this king. What am I going to do? You should know you serve a real, true, living God. And what I see so interesting about this king of the land of Israel, he had less faith than this servant girl who'd been taken away from her home. She saw hope, whereas he was hopeless. The king had divided loyalty. She remained loyal to God, even though she was far from home and her situation looked bleak. The king, he acted as if God were dead. This little servant girl knew God was alive. And beyond that he was working. The king, he could only think about himself. She was selfless. And as I just kept thinking about that, I realized as followers of Christ, we need to understand something. We so live in the here and now, forgetting that we aren't citizens here, but we're citizens of heaven. We forget where we're really going. And I believe this servant girl throws down the gauntlet that no matter where I am, I'm serving God. No matter what's going on, I'm going to be a light. And when people come to us, we need to be ready. We need to be ready. This is why Peter says, if someone asks you about your hope, be ready to ask. So if you have to go home and pray about what you're going to say, then do it. Pray, be ready. When people ask you, why do you have hope in the midst of a dark time? You know why? You serve a living God. You serve a God who's not dead. My hope never disappoints. This is why. This is what we are to be. This is what we can be. So this is what we see right away here. And then what I love about this story is not only does it scream about a changed life, but it really screams grace. You see, when Naaman came to see Elisha, he understood something. That grace is literally the undeserved and unearned favor of God. Because see, Naaman came, which is really interesting. I love what he came with. I want to read this to you because he came with enough stuff. It was about $3 million. He carried 750 pounds of silver, 150 pounds of gold, and this is the part I like, 10 sets of clothing. I don't understand. There wasn't an order. I'm wondering how valuable these clothes, that put it over the top, right? Clothing, I just can't get over that. 10 sets of clothes, I'm sure, whatever. But grace is what it is. Naaman sets out thinking he can buy his healing. He comes to Elisha on his high horse, expecting Elisha to do something. Naaman felt he was due or entitled to having Elisha come out to see him because of all that he brought and all that he was, literally trying to buy his healing. You see, we know that isn't the way God works, right? We know we can't buy his favor, right? I think we know that, but oftentimes we slip back and we try to think that we can do something so that God will hear our prayer, so that God will begin to answer the way we want to. We know it's by grace, but every once in a while we need to be reminded that it is grace of God. And see, Naaman's making the mistake of trying to earn it. And this is why Elisha does this. Elisha sends a messenger to Naaman. Go and wash 7 times in the Jordan. Your skin will be restored. You see, Elisha needed to make sure that Naaman was focused on what God could do, not on what Elisha could do. When we start to try and earn any little bit of what God can do for us or any little bit of favor from God, we're getting our focus off of God and onto us. And when we start focusing on us, I've come to find out it's a very scary place to be. And this is what Naaman was doing. So Elisha needed to get that focus away from him and onto what God could do. You see, trying to earn God's favor in any way starts to get us into error. And the trap that we begin to fall into is we start to do that. It's so important for us to be reminded of the grace of God. And as I kept looking at grace, I think one of the most difficult parts of it is we've all heard the statement, let go and let God. And honestly, that's kind of like grace. is it's the grace of God. It's what He did. We didn't earn it. And as humans, we seem to have a difficult time letting go. We like control of the situation. And then when it's not in our control, we tend to get a little, oh my gosh, how's this really going to work? Because see, when we're letting go, it's when we're truly and honestly walking in faith. And it's hard to do, letting go and letting God, because we like control. You know, it won't be so blatant as you bring in $3 million to God saying, God, you will now hear me. But maybe you've fallen into that trap. Well, God, I fasted yesterday. Won't you hear me? I've read my Bible 5 days in a row. God will surely answer this prayer. You know, we fall into those little subtle traps. I remember years ago, I don't know if any of you have the YouVersion app on your phone. I'm sure you do. But if you've noticed, it keeps track of how many days in a row you've read the Bible, right? That can be kind of, wow, look how good I am, right? I remember we had just started the church, and I had the flu for the first time in years. And I actually missed a day of reading the Bible. Right? I missed a day. I literally couldn't see straight for one thing. That's how bad off I was. But I literally, you know what I knew I was wrong? I felt guilty. That's awful. Yeah. I mean, it's not right. And so, see, it's that little subtle, we start to think we're going to earn something from God. And it's not how God works. It's grace. It's grace. It's grace. This is who God is. This is what He does. And such a beautiful thing that I see all throughout this. And see, Paul even talks about it in the book of Galatians. And he writes this book, and these people have been serving God. They know the law is not the way to get to God. But all of a sudden, he writes this letter because they're making a mistake. They're falling back into how they used to be. And this is what he says in Galatians 3. He says, "O foolish Galatians, who cast an evil spell on you? For the meaning of Jesus' death was made as clear to you as if you had seen a picture of His death on the cross." He goes on to say this, "How foolish can you be? After starting your new lives in the Spirit, why are you now trying to become perfect by your own human effort?" You see, you start well, and they did, but they were making a mistake and falling back into the law, and the law is based on one thing. It's based on works. And so Paul's like, look, don't do that. So Naaman gets what he's supposed to do from Elisha, who doesn't even come down. So it tells us that he goes away angry. He goes away in a rage. He's like, I will not do this, because he feels disrespected. He felt he deserved more. I love that. He's just upset. He's ready to walk away. He's angry. He's offended at this prophet of God. You ever done that? You ever walked away from God because you don't like what He's telling you, or you don't like what He's trying to ask you to do? This is what I love about God, is He's going to ask you some things to do that just don't seem right. But I love this in verse 13. Here's more unnamed people. A servant girl, you have Naaman's wife, and then you have his officers. Naaman's officers tried to reason with Naaman and said, look, if he told you to do something difficult, wouldn't you have done it? So you should certainly obey him when he says simply, go and wash and be cured. So Naaman went down to the Jordan and dipped himself 7 times, as the man of God had instructed him. His skin became as healthy as the skin of a young child, and he was healed. So this is what happens. And what I love about Naaman is that he goes away angry. He goes away mad. And as I kept looking at that, I thought, man, how often do we, quote unquote, miss God? Naaman was ready to walk away from his healing. Why? Same things that we have. We become stubborn. Have you ever missed God? You miss God because you're stubborn. You see, pride almost interfered with his one chance of being healed. Simply put, we must lay down our lives, lay down our pride, and receive the grace of God. Secondly, as we already talked about, sometimes we miss God because we try to earn His favor. We try to earn His favor. Third, what I think is so important is sometimes we miss God is that we don't listen. We don't listen to advice. Naaman listened to his wife, who listened to her servant girl. He listened to his officials. You can't really get lower than who he's listening to, but he did. I'm telling you, it's so important that we have godly people and godly counsel, and we listen to the advice they give. You know, another reason we miss God is we come to Him with preconceived ideas on our answers to our prayers. We have preconceived ideas on how our prayers are going to be answered, just like Elisha. This is what I love. We come to God. Have you ever done this? We come to God with a prayer, and it's couched in the solution. Have you ever done that? Well, you kind of say, God, I'm coming to you right now. I really know you need to have blankety blank. I'm not going to say anything, but you give Him the answer in your question. You ever done that? And you think you're kind of saying this is how it should be. And I think one of the most difficult parts is when you pray the Lord's Prayer. You know, He says, not my will, but yours be done. And as I kept looking at that and thinking of that, I'm so reminded of last week with the widow. And she came with empty jars. And I just believe it's so important that we come to God empty. God, your will, not mine. Fifth, what I really think sometimes we miss an answer to God is we don't follow through. If Naaman would have dipped in that water 4 times or 6 times, he would not have had skin that was healed. And follow through can be so important when it comes to God. Don't stop until He tells you. Don't stop until He tells you to. 6, a lot of times we simply miss God by very simply we have a lack of faith. Lack of faith. Something I like about Naaman is he had to finally trust God. He had to finally trust Elisha to do something that made absolutely no sense to him. To go dip in a river, the Jordan River, when he could go to better water, he had to actually do it. But look at what happens to Naaman's life. It says in verse 15, after Naaman is healed, Naaman and his entire party went back to find the man of God. They stood before him and they said this to Elisha, now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel. All the world. Naaman is no longer riding on a horse. He's no longer riding in a chariot, but now he's standing before Elisha. He is literally a new man. He is literally a new creation. And the grace of God is changing him. This is what grace does. I came across one term this week that what grace begins in our life is grace-fueled obedience in our life. And this is what we begin to see in Naaman, a life that is totally changed. Now he says, look, I know what I used to serve. I know whom I used to serve. Now I will only serve God because that is all there is. You see, just because we have the grace of God in us and working through us doesn't mean we don't obey and do what He wants. If anything, grace should begin to cause our desires to change. Our desires should change because of the thankfulness we have towards God. Naaman's desire changed from serving the false idols he did serve to this God that now healed him. Because really, when it comes down to it, why would we want to disobey? Grace has never been an excuse to sin, and Paul answers that rather bluntly in Romans 6. Paul says this, should we keep on sinning so that God can show us more and more of His grace? Of course not. Since we have died to sin, how can we continue to live in it? Grace brings change in our life, and Naaman is a changed man. And when you look at this story, there's another interesting statement that Naaman makes. He asks Elisha, can I take some of the dirt back? He wants to take some dirt back. You see, in the ancient Near East, it was believed that a god could only be worshipped on the soil where the god was located. See, Naaman knows that he can't stay in the land of God, but he could take some of the land of God with him. You see, he's just reiterating and showing the heart change inside of him. Why? The grace of God. And he's taking all of his gifts back with him. This soil would have been a reminder to Naaman of a changed life. And he's making it clear that he wants to serve and only serve God. You see, it provides just a beautiful picture of this man Naaman, who's now literally a picture of salvation. He had an incurable disease, leprosy. And we've all had that incurable disease, which was sin. And God took that away. Why? Why? Because of His grace. As I said at the beginning, leprosy is oftentimes a picture of sin. And I say it this way. Leprosy was an awful skin disease. And I don't know if you've ever had, I started thinking about that and I read something. I was like, man, have you ever had dry skin? I don't know when the heater's on right now or when winter kicks in, my fingertips get dry as a bone and it hurts. Well, I don't like it, right? And then also for about, I think 6 years now, I've had a patch on one of my legs that is extremely dry. No idea why. And I itch it a lot. And there's sometimes I itch it when I'm sleeping. That's what Robin tells me, right? I have no idea. But it's still there. It's still there and it still bothers me. And what's really interesting is, you want to know why it's still there? I've never fully dealt with it. And I know most of you, I've seen you, I know you know Jesus, but I'm going to tell you right now, as I kept looking and praying about this Sunday, is there still those times and those areas in our life that we aren't willing to surrender to God. There's those little sins that we think are no big deal. But I'm going to tell you right now, every once in a while, you know what they do? They flare up. And they cause us to trip, and they cause us to stumble. Why? Because we've never fully dealt with them. And they come back to bother us. They come back to hinder us. They come back to cause us to stumble. They come back and they bring shame. And I'm telling you, what I see in this story is that God healed Naaman of his leprosy. God can heal you of any sin problem that you may have. And I mean those areas that you're not willing to surrender. And I'm saying today, this is the time to literally let go and trust God. It's not worth it, because it will rear up and it'll be at a time you don't want to. And as I kept thinking about it and talking with Robin, as we've been going through life, people going through life, you see them stumbling back to old sins because of the pressures of life. Don't allow that. Deal with it today. Understand the grace of God. Unearned favor. Allow Him to work in and through your life. Surrender that area to Him. And as I'm saying this, I guarantee there are some of you here that you know exactly what I'm talking about. You know that area if you're honest with yourself. God's either been speaking to you about it, or you know it's just an area of your life that you need to surrender fully to Him and obey what God is telling you to do. Naaman had to fully obey what Elisha said, or that leprosy would not have gone away. Naaman had to follow through on what Elisha said, or it wouldn't have dissipated. And what did he do? He did it. Some of you have some things, those things that are causing you to stumble. You know what's precipitating it. And God's like, you need to get rid of that. You need to follow through. You need to follow through. This is what God wants. He'll make you white as snow. This is what He did. He cleansed him and He makes you whole.